One of Fallout's iconic elements are its weapons, and Bethesda was well aware of that going into Fallout 3's development. They brought some of the most distinctive weapons back, like the 10mm pistol, Ripper, and Gauss rifle, but also introduced a whole new arsenal ranging from your typical first-person shooter guns like shotguns and assault rifles, to sci-fi fare like the mind-altering mesmetron and mole-exploding sticks. Not all of their ideas made it into the final release, and in this episode, we're taking an in-depth look at weapons that were cut from the core game. Many of the cut weapons are technically used in a test cell, and you can check them out by typing in COC test QA items into the console. This room contains nearly every item in a series of mailboxes. To begin, there's an unused projectile named Bolt Projection that appears to be a crossbow bolt. There is no crossbow in the final game, but this suggests they considered it at one point in development. It's too bad this was cut, as it would have been a perfect post-apocalyptic weapon, but bows and crossbows would finally appear 12 years later in Fallout 76, so yay? There's a projectile called Phil's Fun Projectile internally, but in-game it's called Doggy. It uses the NIF file for dogs, but isn't linked to any weapons and is totally unused as a result. There were two QA testers at Bethesda named Phil Glazer and Phil Georgatos, and it was likely made by one of the two for fun. When set up, guns now shoot a Lovecraftian nightmare dog that's missing its fucking eyeballs and barks when fired. So of course I made a dumb mod that makes nearly every projectile firing weapon use them. Your game will probably crash, but it's pretty fun shooting buckshot that's 8 dogs. There's a dungeon called Queen Ant's Hatchery that contains fire ants and a giant ant queen. This ant queen uses the same spit attack as other ant queens, but there's an unused weapon intended for this specific creature. It was never set up, but would have utilized a cut projectile called Fire Spit. It's statistically identical to their regular attack, but this version looks like fire, which would have made more sense considering the other creatures in this location are fire ants. I'm guessing this would have dealt more damage than their default attack, and that this would have been the most powerful version. There's a mesh called GT Boulder Projectile, and it's a giant rock. It's used by 2 unused projectiles, and the first is called Boulder Projectile. This was intended for a super mutant behemoth attack that wouldn't have been available to the player. Behemoths still have an unused attack animation where they would have thrown a boulder and then taken out another one. The shopping cart cages on their back are used to transport prisoners, but this suggests they would have carried boulders in them as well. Behemoths have shields made from car doors and were fittingly once going to use salvaged car parts as weapons too. The same boulder is also used as a placeholder by a projectile called Fusion Car Battery, implying they were going to throw fusion car batteries at the player which would have exploded. Both of these ideas were great, and giving them a ranged attack would have made them into a more engaging enemy. But apparently there's a bug that causes these non-hit scan projectiles to deal no damage, and that's why these got the axe. One of their early designs shows an engine attached to a chain used like a flail. This rock throwing ability would later be added to the creature in Fallout 4. There's also evidence of several cut ammo types. All bullet projectiles in Fallout 3 use a model named 7.62mm, an ammo type used in both pistols and rifles. This is used, but there is no 7.62 ammo type in the final game. Some weapons, like the 10mm pistol, utilize bullet casings named 45, but there's also no 45 caliber weapons or ammunition in game. There's an unused texture for 44 caliber centerfire ammo that would have been used with Lincoln's repeater, and was likely intended to appear alongside it at the Museum of History. Presumably this ammo type would have been the only rounds compatible with the weapon, but introducing an entirely new ammo for a single weapon isn't ideal, and it seems that Lincoln's repeater was later altered to use 44 Magnum rounds, an ammo type used by multiple weapons. Interestingly, the ammo box mentions a pre-war company called Branson Repeating Arms, a company that's never been mentioned anywhere else. The firing sound for the 10mm SMG is named Weapon Pistol 22 internally, suggesting that it was originally intended for a 22 pistol. There is no 22 caliber gun in Fallout 3 though, implying it was cut and the sound was later recycled for the submachine gun. The unused image icon for 22 rounds still remains, suggesting it made it relatively far into development. Early previews mentioned that the hunting rifle was 22 caliber as well. It seems there would have been a unique 22 rifle firing sound, though it's unclear if there would have been an additional long rifle ammo type. After 22 caliber weapons were cut, the hunting rifle was altered to use 32 rounds instead. There's an unused inventory icon for the missile launcher and its ammunition that were likely made very early in development. The missile launcher is depicted in a totally different style, similar to some of its concept art. The style of the image for mini nukes was also altered at one point. There's a folder called Small Pip-Boy Images, and many of the files in this folder are unused. These were going to appear on screen, perhaps when you had the corresponding weapon equipped or when you picked it up. It's unclear what their exact purpose was though, or why they didn't make it into the final game, particularly considering how many of them there are. In Fallout 4, there's a unique weapon called the Cryolater, and it's arguably one of the coolest weapons in the series, but it was originally intended to appear in Fallout 3. There's still an unused model for it and schematic ingredients, a coolant component, and a liquid nitrogen canister. One of the pieces of concept art suggests the nitrogen canister would have been worn like a backpack. Interestingly, this design is much different than how it finally appeared, and it's also spelled Mortal Kombat style here. There's even an unused frost damage effect that likely would have been used alongside it. The weapon seems to have been inspired by a weapon from Van Buren's design documents, the freeze gun, which was also going to be built from schematics. In early media previews, this weapon was mentioned in a loading screen that would later be deleted once it was cut. The Cryo Grenade and Cryo Mine were introduced in the Mothership Zeta DLC, but were originally planned to appear in the base game. It's unclear if these would have been schematic weapons too, or if they only could have been bought and found. Interestingly, the cryo weapons used in Mothership Zeta have a completely different appearance than their cut counterparts. It seems they were originally going to be Enclave technology, as there's a Cryo Lab in Raven Rock and a set piece called Cryo Lab that's only used in this room. When they were added in Mothership Zeta, they were given a more alien appearance to fit the DLC's premise. The cut grenade texture would go completely unused, but the cut mine texture would later be recycled for spider drones in Operation Anchorage. It's cool they managed to get some of these ideas in, but the look and attack of the Cryolater was perfect, and it's too bad it got scrapped. While most of the skills from the classic games returned in Fallout 3, a notable exception was the throwing skill. While grenades were useful in some circumstances, it was arguably the worst combat skill in the games that it appeared in, but it's still a cool skill in theory. Bethesda apparently thought so too, as they considered this skill during development and even created an icon for it, but it remains unused, at least as a perk image. It's still present during the GOAT test slideshow in Vault 101 though, and it seems the corresponding question on the test could have marked throwing as a tag skill. Speaking of tag skills, the Enclave Big Guns class appears to only have 2 tag skills in the GEC, but further inspection reveals that their third skill is still throwing. It isn't used, but it's interesting that it's still technically a part of the game. The throwing image would later be recycled as the Heave-Ho perk in New Vegas. Tantalizingly, the actor value for the throwing skill still remains, and would later be repurposed as the survival skill in New Vegas. Its unused description reads, "The higher your throwing skill, the more likely you are to hurl a thrown weapon like a rock, Molotov cocktail, or grenade exactly where you want to." Rocks appeared in Fallout 1, 2, and Tactics, where they could be used as a throwing weapon and during melee attacks. There is no rock weapon though, and all of the assets for it seem to be missing. This likely would have been the weakest throwing weapon and would have been found commonly throughout the Wasteland. The description also mentions a Molotov cocktail, a weapon that appeared in both Fallout 2 and Tactics. There's still a cut model for it that uses the large whiskey bottle, and even 2 cut explosion sounds that would have been used alongside it. There's also a related unused texture for a lighter that would later be recycled for the dynamite attack animation in New Vegas. Obsidian would later complete Bethesda's idea by using the lighter once again for Honest Heart's firebomb weapon, though they used a Sunset Sarsaparilla bottle rather than the existing whiskey texture. There's another weapon that would have used the lighter texture as well, the Nuka cocktail, a more powerful variant of the Molotov cocktail. It appears this is an early version of what eventually became the Nuka grenade. Supporting this, the internal name of the Nuka grenade is Weapon Nuka Cocktail. There's even an unused crafting recipe, and it could have been made by combining a Braxo cleaner, a tin can, turpentine, and an empty bottle of Nuka-Cola. This is almost identical to the crafting requirements to make a Nuka grenade, except that it requires Nuka Quantum instead of an empty bottle. One of the Nuka grenade schematics is given to the player by Sierra Petrovita. She has 2 lines that were recorded before the Molotov and Nuka cocktail were cut.
I don't know a whole lot about weapons, but I do know that it's more powerful than the Molotov cocktail. It explodes in a huge blue flame too. How cool is that?
They brought the character's voice actor Jan Jones back later in development and had her record altered lines that are similar but have no mention of either weapon. Some of the weapons shown throughout this video, like the Nuka and Molotov cocktails, can be restored by the Tale of Two Wastelands mod, and there's a link to that below. After retrieving the Gek during the main questline, the player is attacked and knocked out by a grenade thrown by a group of Enclave soldiers. If you look closely, you'll notice the weapon is a frag grenade that has a light effect applied to it, but intriguingly the sound files reveal this is called the concussion grenade. It's possible this is a cut player weapon, but there are no other remaining art assets related to it, and it's unknown if it was ever meant to appear outside the scene it's used in. Baseballs are miscellaneous items and used in traps, but it seems they were planned to be a player weapon at one point. They're shown in the cut throwing skill image, and most notably there's still an unused first-person model view. Baseball grenades would later appear in Fallout 4, but it's unclear if 3's version would have been similar or if they were actual baseballs that would have been low-tier weapons slightly better than rocks. In the end, it seems that many of the throwing weapons were cut alongside the skill, and the ones that weren't were wrapped up into explosives. In the original games, grenades were classified as throwing weapons, while weapons like plastic explosives were governed by the trap skill. Notably, the Little Leaguer perk mentions throwing, and I have to wonder if it originally improved the player's throwing skill. There's evidence of the explosive skill functioning differently too, as several messages reveal traps could be avoided by having a high enough special stat, similar to the messages found in the original games. The luck-based message reads, "Luckily for you, the trap's closing mechanism fires late. If you had high agility, a different message would appear. You nimbly dodge the trap as it springs shut." There is also a series of low-skill failure messages, each of which begins with the sentence, "You failed to disarm the trap," which is a line straight out of the Interplay games. These messages read, "You probably shouldn't have cut the red wire. It looks like you made the grenades angry. It all seems so much easier in your head. Might be a good time to run. Let's hope you survive to try again." The throwing skill and trap messages would have been a great homage, and it's too bad so much of this was cut. On the other hand, the throwing and trap skills weren't very useful in previous games, so I can definitely understand their decision to combine them. There's an unused unique frag mine, and its naming prefix suggests it was part of the Tranquility Lane sequence. During that section of the main quest line, the player has to kill Mrs. Henderson, and this mine was an alternate method of taking her out. It's linked to an also unused projectile called Oven Projectile, suggesting the mine would have been placed inside the oven in her house. It deals a staggering 300 points of damage and is worth nearly 4,000 caps, making it get one of the most valuable items in Fallout 3. At the location SATCOM Array NW-05A, the player can trigger a nuclear bombardment on the surrounding landscape. These explosions are actually caused by an inaccessible weapon called the SATCOM Nuclear Strike, which uses the missile launcher as a model. The attacks from this weapon deal over 1,700 damage, create significant amounts of radiation, and its explosion radius is multiple times larger than that of a mini-nuke. In the final game, there are no unique baseball bats, but there's an unused dirty texture that was made for one. There's also a cut baseball bat called Excalibur, and it deals 13 damage per hit compared to the regular version's 9, along with a higher chance for critical hits and more damage when they happen. It's a reference to a weapon of the same name in the 1994 first-person shooter Rise of the Triad. There's another cut baseball bat named Cursebreaker, and it has the exact same stats as Excalibur. Presumably these would have had a unique effect and/or appearance that would have differentiated them. Equipping either weapon can cause a glitch that turns the player invisible, and this is potentially due to the weapons attempting to access missing textures. There's an unused weapon called Fist that deals no damage, and NPCs treat you as if you're unarmed even when it's equipped. Randomly, this weapon deals small amounts of damage, but it's rare. All other weapons in Fallout 3 use external assets located in the BSA files, but intriguingly this weapon is hard-coded into the engine, suggesting it might have been the very first weapon that was implemented into the game. There's no unique police baton, but there's a cut weapon called O'Grady's Peacemaker, a unique variant of the police baton that has higher durability, deals additional damage, and is slightly more valuable than the generic weapon. Intriguingly, there's no NPC named O'Grady, suggesting it might have been linked to a cut NPC. The police baton implies he might have been a security guard, so perhaps it would have appeared in Vault 101, maybe only when the player returned there. Talon Company NPCs use them as well, so that's a possibility too. Fallout 3 also has many unused locations and world spaces, so it's likely that some, if not most of the weapons in this video would have been found in cut areas. There's a cut unique variant of Brass Knuckles called Love Tap, but there's little to go off of beyond its name. It deals additional damage, more critical damage, has a higher chance to cause critical hits, and uses less AP and VATS, but interestingly only has half the durability of the normal version. While there is a unique version of Spiked Knuckles in the base game, there are no unique Brass Knuckles. There's an unused version of the nail board called Breaker. It's stronger than the base version, but weaker than the game's only unique nail board, the Board of Education. It's unknown if this was meant to be a weapon that could be found in the early game, or if it would have had some effect that would have made it more viable and would have been found later on. Super mutant behemoths use an inaccessible weapon called Fire Hydrant. It weighs 309 pounds, has an insane durability of 1000, and deals 100 damage per strike. It looks totally absurd when equipped, as it was made for NPCs that are multiple times larger than the player. There's an unused version of the laser rifle, and its internal name implies it was used in a press demo. It's visually identical to the regular version, and the only differences are that it deals slightly less damage and less critical hit damage, but has a much higher critical hit chance. There's an unused unique version of the 32 pistol called Law Dog. It's possible this would have been carried by 3Dog, one of the rare NPCs to not actually have any weapons in their inventory. There's a cut assault rifle named Wanda that deals more damage than the normal version. Like the 32, there's no unique variant of the assault rifle in the core game either. There is a character named Wanda mentioned in a note at the Statesman Hotel, and it's possible it would have appeared here, but I suspect these shared names are a coincidence. There's an unused weapon called Black Bart's Bane, a unique variant of the BB gun. The name is a reference to a scene in the film A Christmas Story, but it's unclear where it would have appeared. This variant deals twice as much damage per shot, deals double critical damage, and has twice the durability when compared to the base gun. Because this was cut, there's no unique variant of the BB gun in the core game, which is unfortunate since the regular BB gun is one of the game's least viable weapons. There's an unused sound file intended for the 10mm pistol that sounds more appropriate than what was used. Here's how the weapon sounds in the final game, and how the cut version differs. Colonel Autumn has a unique variant of the 10mm pistol, and while it was marked as playable, I don't think the developers ever intended the player to have access to it. Despite that, it can be attained during the quest The Waters of Life by manipulating the third-person camera to an angle that allows you to loot his body. This variant is more powerful than the normal version, and is missing from his inventory later in the main questline. Sonora Cruz is the leader of the Regulators, and she has a unique 10mm pistol. It's in her inventory, but she's an essential character and can never be killed. She commands a faction of bounty hunters, but her confidence is strangely set to cowardly, meaning she'll always flee in combat, making her weapon effectively cut. The most interesting aspect of the gun is that it deals 100 damage per hit. To put that into perspective, the generic version only deals 9 damage, and 100 is the same amount as the Behemoth's fire hydrant attack. I suspect she could once attack the player and maybe even be killed, but she was later made immortal and cowardly, so the player couldn't lose the benefit of the Lawbringer perk. There's an unused effect called atomization that was made for Fat Man critical hit kills. It's possible this was intended for a unique variant of the weapon, or it might be an early version of the critical hit kill effect. After being hit by it, enemies become transparent, and this is potentially due to its texture being missing. Inside Anchorage Memorial, there's a unique version of the sledgehammer called the Tenderizer. It's already much better than the normal sledgehammer, but it was originally intended to have a very interesting ability. There's an unused effect named after the weapon, and after hitting a target, it reduces their damage resistance by 5 permanently. As far as I'm aware, no other weapon has an effect like this, and it was likely cut for the same reason. It would have made this weapon more compelling, and the effect fits well with its name. There's a variant of Mirelurks called Nucalurks that are only found inside the Nuka-Cola plant. They were exposed to the isotope that makes Nuka Quantum glow and drop an item called Nucalurk meat, but are otherwise identical to other forms of the creature. However, it seems that wasn't always going to be the case, as there's an unused effect called Nucalurk attack. This would have appropriately caused their attacks to deal radiation damage, and I'm guessing this was cut to make the dungeon easier, as the Nuka plant already has passive radiation. The dart gun has 2 effects called damage left leg and damage right leg, which deals 1000 damage to these limbs when hit, immediately crippling any NPC not marked essential. Interestingly, there's some unused effects like damage chest, damage left arm, and damage right arm, and it's possible these were intended for unique weapons. There's an effect called damage head that's only used by Robo-Brains though, so these might have been intended for enemy weapons. There's another unused effect called Deathclaw Poison that would deal 10 damage per second over 10 seconds. Deathclaws could deal poison damage in Tactics, and it seems they contemplated this ability for them in Fallout 3 as well. In the base game, the only creature that deals poison damage are rad scorpions, making the perks that increase poison resistance nearly pointless. There's also a cut effect that would have lowered the target's poison resistance, while another unused archetype effect cancels any poison effects on an actor. I'm not sure if this was meant for a cut antidote item, or if it's a remnant of Oblivion that's still left over in the engine. Regardless, the poison system could have used additional fleshing out to justify the perks that affect it. Unused ideas from concept art aren't cut content, but it's interesting to see what they considered, and I'll take any opportunity to talk about Adam Adawick's work. He was one of the first developers to work on the project, and over the course of several years, he made hundreds of jaw-dropping images. This one depicts the Mason Jar Mine, a makeshift weapon consisting of nails, dynamite, a cigarette, and a mason jar. Definitely a cool idea, but it would have had an impractically long fuse. Another shows an explosive piggy bank, which I'm guessing was the predecessor for what would eventually become the Bottle Cap Mine. This series of images depicts several melee weapons being dual-wielded, a feature already used in Oblivion that could have worked well here. One even shows a hammer melee weapon that never made it beyond image form. The flamer had a hose that connected the weapon to the fuel pack, which made it more realistic but was cut out of its final design. There's even what appears to be a connection port for this hose on the back of the weapon model, and it's unclear why they left this out. The shish kebab was initially called the Shishka sword, and like the flamer, it also had a hose that connected it to the backpack. It was initially crafted using a crowbar that was hammered flat, rather than the lawnmower blade it actually uses. Mirelurks were intelligent in some of their early designs and even utilized tools. One image lists various weapons they would have used, including a femur bone, tridents, whips knotted with razors, and what might be the most fucking metal weapon in the entire series, nets weighed down by the skulls of their victims. Another image shows one using some sort of club, and there's even a cut variant of the creature called the Catfish Mirelurk. Seeing these makes me disappointed that the creature ended up as little more than glorified mud crabs. Various energy weapons like plasma mines, plasma rifles, and the Gauss rifle are shown emitting a purple light. This could have looked really cool, but was later changed to green as a design decision. For some reason, there's a clown head missile launcher attachment. I'm not sure what effect this would have had, but I am glad it never made it very far. In the book The Art of Fallout 3, lead artist Istvan Paley revealed how Bethesda approached weapon design. It wasn't long into the project before I heard rumblings amongst producers cursing the number of playable weapons we had to build for this game. There are quite a few, and the amount of work that goes into getting a weapon built, animated, and programmed is substantial, comparable to the amount of development overhead a new creature model requires. On the other hand, the effort was certainly worth it. The amount of variety in the weapons, both in terms of design and functionality, is very entertaining and makes the player's discovery of a new example a memorable experience. The design process for these varied greatly depending on the nature of the weapon. The more mundane designs, either real-world or intended to feel like real-world, such as an assault rifle or shotgun, were designed by combining interesting elements from various existing guns into a new whole that felt slightly familiar but original at the same time. When it came to the build your own and other exotic weapons, we went crazy. Physical plausibility may seem to take a back seat to some of these ideas, but the player must suspend belief and put himself in the mindset of a culture that imagined many nuclear reactors and ray guns as real possibilities in the near future. That being said, Adam Adowicz was intent on making sure every weapon design, no matter how outlandish, looked authentic and mechanically sound. Sometimes less is more, and not all of these weapons would have made Fallout 3 into an even better game. But more unique variants would have been a nice touch, while the Cryolater throwing equipment and crossbow were genuinely intriguing. Ultimately though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.